Welcome to episode 88 of Live with a Maverick. My name is Dominic Lee, founder of Maverick Actuary. We are a content community. Our mission is to maximize the impact and value of quant professionals on a global scale. The goal of this series is to educate our community on the most relevant themes in actuarial science, risk management, and analytics. The theme of today's discussion is climate scenario analysis. And we are very excited to have with us our guest for today's episode, Lloyd Richards. Lloyd is Director and Head of Actuarial at Crowe UK, a consulting, auditing, and technology firm with offices across the globe. He is also a teaching fellow at Queen Mary University of London in the School of Mathematical Sciences. Welcome, Lloyd.
Thank you very much for having me. Nice to be here.
Excellent. I'd love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I think you've done a better job than I would have done. I'm a managing director at Crowe. And at Crowe, I head up our actuarial services in the UK. And really, I've spent my entire career in consulting. Crowe is sort of my third employer. I've touched on lots of different areas over that time: pensions, life, GI, risk, and now I largely work across climate and sustainability. And it's quite an interesting, exciting time to be there because we're seeing lots of actuaries getting more and more involved in climate, in sustainability, and in those areas. You also mentioned I'm a teaching fellow in the School of Mathematical Sciences at 𝗟𝗶𝘆𝗥𝗶𝗰 𝗪. We probably have a lot of my students listening to this episode because I know they're amongst your top listeners. So hello to all of my first years and previous years students who are listening today. Hope this is interesting, as my lectures probably weren't. So a little about myself. Outside my job, I'm very involved in the actuarial profession in numerous ways, usually around education. So I've been a career ambassador sort of since my early days, a couple of years after joining the profession. I've also represented a number of working parties. Currently, I co-chair the Climate Reporting and Disclosure Working Party, which is very relevant for today. We've recently been published in the British Actuarial Journal, which was a great milestone for us as a working party, and we're potentially going to be at some conferences later this year. I'm also a liveryman with the 𝗟𝗶𝘆𝗥𝗶 Company of Actuaries, which is one of the City of London's livery companies involved in the governance and running of the city, and also has charitable and community aims as well. And really, I like to bring the education of mathematics into a lot of what I do. So you'll often see me on LinkedIn trying to explain mathematical concepts in a different or interesting way, or using the skills I've developed as an actuary in an unusual context. Finally, a little bit about my life outside of work. I'm a keen trail runner. I find it's a really interesting way to see different parts of the world by running through the countryside as fast as you can in different places. So try to find the time to do the occasional ultra marathon. Later this year, I'm going to be running my first ever backyard ultra, which I'm very excited for.
Oh, that's exciting. Ultra, wow. Yeah. I've done one marathon and I've done some distance in the past, but only simple, more shorter distances for the most part. So so shout out first of all to Queen Mary University of London students. Thank you so much for all the support. And a question I want to ask: so what courses do you teach there? Course or courses?
Well, I teach actuarial science. I teach the first year module called Actuarial Professional Development, which is essentially what actuaries do in the real world. And I try to bring sort of as many different guest lecturers as I can to talk to my students. Because I found I was at university, I wanted to be an actuary. I didn't speak to an actuary until I was going to interviews with companies. All of my students have spoken to probably at least 10 actuaries in their first year, and hopefully get another 10 in their second year as well. So they really understand what the profession involves and have heard of lots of different areas. They know it's not just pensions, not just insurance. They speak to risk actuaries, health actuaries. I know you had Bart on a recent episode.
Oh yeah, Bart.
Then one of Bart's team was talking about football analytics to my students a few months back. So I try and give them as broad a set of lessons as I can.
Yeah. That's one thing I noticed with schools nowadays, not just in the UK, in the US as well. There's more. That's a tremendous growth in the actuarial profession in terms of bringing the practical side into the classroom, which I think is great. I think when I was there, we definitely had a practical course. Well, we actually had a couple of people come in, but it was still in its infancy at the time, but it seems to be much more mainstream now.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you mentioned you're at Crowe UK, you're director, managing director, director, head of actuarial. I'd love to explore that more. I'd love to learn more about the company and your current role there.
Yeah, sure. It's an absolutely fascinating business to work for. There'll be a lot of actuaries, even here in the UK, who've never heard of us or may know us only as pensions auditors. And mostly it is an audit practice, but I work for a really small part of the business that's the consulting practice. It's about 25 people now, and we offer services to our clients across building resilience, delivering transformation, mastering data, integrating sustainability, which is where our climate work comes in, and risk and governance. And it's because it's so small, it's a lot like working for a boutique consultancy, but then we're part of that broader audit firm, which means we have really well-established support teams, IT and HR and marketing that you don't often get in smaller consultancies. The company that I joined 8 years ago that eventually got bought by Crowe, called 𝗟𝗏𝗃𝗄, fantastic place to work. Still a lot of the old 𝗟𝗏𝗃𝗄 people are still here at Crowe. But we didn't have an IT team. We didn't have a HR team. We didn't have a marketing team. You had to do all that yourself whilst also being a consultant for your clients. So it's very nice to have those support functions back. And I've always really enjoyed how Crowe works as an organization. So I've worked in a variety of different roles throughout my career. And I think lots of actuarial roles that you can do are jobs where the client has to spend money on you as an actuary. They have to get an actuary to do pensions valuations or transfer values. They have to get an actuary to sign off on reserves. The projects that I do now are far more discretionary and value add. Nobody has to spend money on me. They choose to spend money on me, and they recognize the value and the skill set that an actuary can bring. And that's what creates a really different relationship from the outset when a client is actually choosing to spend their limited budget on you and recognizes your expertise. And I think a large part of why clients use us is they recognize we're really good at tailoring solutions to their needs. So we don't come with pre-existing notions of what the solution is going to be. We actually try and sort of learn what our client is facing, learn what makes them unique, and try and upskill all our clients and leave them empowered. So ideally, they no longer need us.
That sounds great. And that sounds like a relationship, very relationship driven, very niche, very interesting work, a broad range of projects. That sounds very neat. Now, I didn't mention, so today we're going to talk about climate scenario analysis, but and the episode, of course, is very close to the climate. But before we get into the details of that, I want to take a step back to understand the big picture. So let's talk a bit about sustainability. So when we hear the term sustainability, what does that mean, or how is that relevant within the context of risk management?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's actually a really smart place to start, because what you find when talking about sustainability is there's no commonly agreed definition. Between organizations and even sometimes within a single organization, people mean different things when they say the word sustainability. So a lot of organizations equate climate change as sustainability, and the only sustainability matters they worry about are the climate and global warming. A lot go a bit further and have started thinking about nature and biodiversity and water usage. Some then go even further and think about the financial sustainability of their own organization, or broader still, sustainability of the economy as a whole. And then when you start to think about those things, you'll often capture other diversity metrics. So how can you be a sustainable business if you aren't fostering a diverse workforce? And you start to bring in the DEI areas that get captured. And I think as you start to bring all those together, you start to get at how the more mature organizations define sustainability, which is how you bring all these various strands of environmental impacts together with a clear social purpose that your organization has, and how you try and make decisions that foster a culture that lives up to all those elements.
So it sounds a little bit, even though I know within the term ESG, I think the S is social. I think it's correct. So even though the S is social, I think it sounds like it kind of ties to the S in the ESG. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. They're all
Okay.
part of the whole. And I think companies that do the best job of this are recognizing the interconnectedness and drawing things together under a single strategy.
Okay, great. Now, as you sit in the UK, you're very close to this work. You do a lot of projects regarding climate. As you sit in the UK, so you see what's happening locally and you look across the globe, how would you describe the current sustainability landscape?
Yeah, that's also a really smart place to start, because there's a joke going around at the moment that if you take any four letters and mash them together, you'll find they represent a sustainability framework. So I'm going to list some, and we'll see if listeners recognize any of these. TCFD, TNFD, CSRD, ESRS, SFDR, TPT, PCAF, CDP, ISO, GRI, NGFS, NZAMI, GPANS, PRI, UNEP, UNGRC, SDGs. I could go on.
Isn't there ISSB too?
ISSB, S1 and S2. Yeah, thank you. You spotted one missing. No, it's absolutely loads. Pretty much any letters you bring together will be one. So I think it's really challenging to keep up. If you've got a busy job, even if you're very focused on climate reporting, how can you keep up with which of these apply to you and what do you have to do under each of them? And I actually have a huge fear at the moment that there's a lot of very dedicated people who really care about climate and sustainability, and they're working in sustainability functions or organizations that can have a real impact. And they're just stuck on this reporting treadmill. They're not getting enough time to actually enact real change, which is the things that they want to do, because they're so busy reporting what their organization's doing. And that's taking sort of 10, 11 months of the year, leaving 1 month to actually do stuff. And it's a really difficult tightrope because reporting is really important. It forces companies to make commitments and it allows people to hold those companies to account. And there are some voluntary initiatives out there that I think are really valuable that try and sort of draw a pathway together through all of these initiatives and try and make people understand how to, understand the interconnectedness between all these initiatives and how you can give one answer to many different sections. But I think we need to help organizations find a way to focus on the bits of reporting that matter to them. So ideally in a principles-based way rather than ticking boxes, which is the bit that takes a long time and leaves people very disheartened. And in the UK, a lot of what you're seeing really in terms of climate reporting and some of the detailed stuff on scenario modeling, which we're going to talk about, dates back to the CBES exercise, which is yet another acronym. That's the Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario. That was an exercise conducted by the Bank of England about 3 years ago now. And it used the NGFS scenarios and asked organizations to essentially evaluate their investments on a line-by-line basis under those scenarios. So if you think the world is going to keep warming to within 1.5 degrees, what does that mean for your investment? If you think we're going to have a 4-degree world, what does that mean for each of your investments? And I think it's a real indication of maturity how different organizations approach that exercise. So some organizations took the exam question, which was run these scenarios, tell us the result. They did the maths, they reported to the Bank of England, they congratulated themselves on a job completed and left it to one side. And I don't think that was what the Bank of England wanted. The better organizations, those more mature and understanding, sort of realized that what the bank was really asking is fundamentally they don't care what the numbers are. What they were doing is saying, we need you to start investing in scenario analysis. We need you to start building out these models, start figuring out what the challenge is, start seeing where you have data gaps, and start sort of using that investment because it's going to be a really important tool to help you make decisions going forwards. And I feel that organizations that I've worked with that use the CBES as almost as a leapfrog to start investing in scenario analysis, they're now at a real advantage. You can see the real step up in terms of quality, in terms of what they're putting out.
Great. So actually, I have a follow-up on that. You talked about the CBES exercise, and I think it came from the Bank of England. Now, when we talk about climate, different people have been talking about this topic for different lengths of time. The earliest I can remember, this is before your students' time, this is when I was fairly young as well, is I remember, I think Al Gore had this film, I forget the name of the film, but something it was on climate. So, there have been people at the forefront of that movement. I think Bill Gates might have been talking about it as well. He had a really good TED Talk on it as well. But what was a catalyst, or was there a catalyst for the Bank of England's directive around CBES? Is something specific happen, or was it just more kind of a snowball effect?
It's an inconvenient truth, I think, is the film that you're referencing there. It's quite interesting. I think in terms of where things are at in the UK, it's almost that the time was right. Globally now, these things are being pushed in different parts of the globe in different ways, but generally there's a consensus that, we get it now. We get that climate change really is happening, really is having huge impacts. There's no more debating whether it's a thing or not. It's now about debating how bad is it going to be and how do we mitigate the risk. So I think a lot of the COP events that have happened have led into that and have pushed some real action there, even though they got a bit of a slating in the media for not really enacting change. Actually, some of the discussions that happen behind the scenes there have led to some of the regulatory initiatives that are now coming out.
Okay, great. Now, climate scenario analysis, I promise we're going to get to, to some of the details on that. But one more thing I want to mention first. So climate scenario analysis is used to measure climate-related financial risks. So what are the key categories of risks being measured in this capacity?
Yeah, so climate risk isn't just one risk. I think if you read the media and look at stuff about climate change, the risk that they focus on is physical risk. And that's kind of the obvious one. That's quite simply as the climate changes, extreme weather events increase in both frequency and severity. That increases the likelihood of insurance claims if you're looking at your underwriting portfolio, asset values declining if you're talking about your investment portfolio, potentially also operational risk impacts. If a climate event knocks out an office or a data center and you can't use that office or data center for a day, then that's a real physical impact of climate change on your business, causing an impact. But probably the bigger risk, and the one that you won't see in the media, is transition risk. And that's the macroeconomic risk that represents the really real challenges of transitioning to a low carbon economy and everything that means for organizations throughout the supply chain. So as we reduce our reliance on carbon, what does that mean in terms of more expensive transport of goods, more expensive sourcing of power and different types of power, potentially introducing carbon budgets and being charged for your emissions. But also then there's the opportunity side of things. So increased investment in green energy and solutions that are needed to reduce those emissions and what those can mean as opportunities. And then finally, we can think about litigation risk, which is sort of the third pillar of climate risk. It's less relevant to scenario modeling, but it's important to think about nonetheless. And that's kind of the risk of climate-related lawsuits and the associated costs. And generally, I think the media has you thinking about, class action lawsuits by Indigenous people against Shell as a classic example of litigation risk. But it can happen on a much smaller scale. You see a lot of climate protesters around the City of London sometimes targeting banks, investment managers, even insurance companies. Now they've realized that the underwriting of coal plants is an essential part of that financing structure, and that actually targeting them is maybe a way to put pressure on them. So I think nobody in the financial services industry is immune from potential lawsuits in the future.
So as we think of those risks, the physical risk, the transition risk, the legal risk, is there any, like, as you think of it from a financial perspective, how it impacts the balance sheet for companies, is there, I don't know, a hierarchy, a prioritization, or is it just kind of like across the board there, everyone's looking at them in tandem?
Yeah, it's so different for different organizations. In financial services, really, you tend to not have a massive physical presence in the world. But then your investments do. If you're investing in coal, oil, gas, and stuff that has physical presences in the world and long supply chains, then that's where the physical risk comes in. But if you're thinking just about pure investments in retail or whatever else, then that's much more of a transition-focused thing. So different companies are looking at different things. There's one insurer that I've worked in the past, which has a very large real estate book in the UK, and they're doing loads of flood risk modeling. They don't care about sort of more extreme weather events that you'll be getting, like hurricanes and tidal waves and all that stuff, because that's not going to hit the UK, but we're going to have increased flooding. So that's what they're modeling over here.
No, I would imagine that, well, like you said, depending on the nature of the organization, there could be some resistance. So especially in the energy sector, if you're talking about non-renewables. But one of the things I think is interesting, and hopefully I'm not going too far off scope here, is when it comes to energy, I think diversification is important. I think sometimes the conversation is simplified to the point where we just go from non-renewables to 100% renewables, where I think the truth is somewhere in between. So I guess maybe we're in that spectrum. I know that like carbon capture and storage, there are certain things you can do, mitigative measures you can do around non-renewables. Like where does that kind of fit into the broader conversation of?
Yeah, I mean, technological solutions are an interesting thing. I mean, they're not a silver bullet. I think you find people are split. There are those sort of who are very evangelical about technological solutions. Say, look, we can carry on emitting as much as we want because in 20 years' time, we'll be able to safely remove all of the carbon from the atmosphere and it'll all be fine. That's not true. But there are also people who say you shouldn't allow for any technological solutions in any of your modeling, any of your projections. You should be reducing carbon to zero. And that's quite a harsh view of the world as well, that doesn't really recognize the real issues that companies have to face and that global economies have to face as part of the transition. And the answer is somewhere in the middle. You have to recognize you can't switch off every coal plant tomorrow and replace them with solar panels. It takes time to transition. And the amount of time it takes depends on what your economy is like, what your energy mix is already like. Some countries are already quite far along that transition and are able to provide most of their power through renewables. Some countries, even in the EU, are very behind. If you look at Poland, for instance, it's heavily reliant on coal power, even though the rest of the EU is quite far ahead globally in terms of renewables.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion especially when you talk about transition risk. one of the things I noticed, even taking a step back, like during the pandemic, I just think from a broader societal perspective, risk management is tricky. Let's be real. We're in that space and you have to look at many things happening at the same time. So when I think of some of those organizations, first thing that comes to mind is what happens to the workers. You have these large organizations. You can't just assume that it's just going to disappear and then there's no downstream impact. So that's something I find interesting. So let's get into the meat of it now. Now we can finally talk about, now that we set the tone, we can talk about climate scenario analysis. So how would you describe climate scenario analysis?
Yeah. So because I know a lot of your listeners are students, and potentially even my students, I'm going to start a little bit basic with how I see the whole suite of stress and scenario testing tools and build up from stress testing to the details of scenario analysis. So in general, lots of actuarial problems are solved by building a model. Models take data, make some assumptions about the future, do some calculations, and give a result. That's about it. You have inputs, your inputs are the data, which you know, the assumptions, which are the bits you don't know, and you're filling it with a guess or an educated guess. Sometimes that's just because you don't have the data, or sometimes it's because it's longer term projections where you won't know the answer until the future, but you make a sensible assumption. You then do a bunch of maths to that and you get your answer. It's kind of easy, right? But models are a representation of reality. They aren't reality itself. So whatever answer you get from your model, no matter how much time you spend with it, that answer is wrong. And that's a thing that actuaries are quite used to explaining and understanding, is that all of our models are wrong. They will never get the right answer. The important question is, how wrong might our model be? Well, the thing in any model that's most likely to be wrong is the assumptions. Everything else can be validated, tested, checked, the calculations can be checked, the data can be reviewed against other sources, but the assumptions, they're the educated guess bit and the bit that's most likely to be wrong. So we can see how wrong my model might be and how wrong my results might be by seeing how much my answer changes when I make a variation in the assumptions. So the first, most basic type of variation you can run is a univariate stress test. That means changing just one of my assumptions. So I might have a pension scheme projection where I think future inflation is going to be 3%. And I say, okay, if it's not 3%, it's actually 4%. What happens to my results? And I can run the model again with 4% instead of 3 and see what the impact is. The next is a multivariate stress test, so changing 2 or more assumptions at once, but otherwise works in kind of exactly the same way. You change the assumptions, you run the numbers, get the results. Scenario analysis is about creating more of a narrative. You can be as simple or as complex with analysis as you like, but the whole point is creating an internally consistent assumption set that follows a storyline that can be explained to people. So with climate scenarios, nobody really has a clue exactly how things will play out. We're reasonably confident over what many of the climate impacts will look like over certain emissions pathways. That's been done to death over years. There's some really clever people working on that, and it's pretty well understood. There's variation there, but we can take that as quite well understood. But trying to then predict what emissions pathways will look like, trying to predict national and company level behavior is really, really hard. There's a US election in about 6 months. And emissions pathways for the US and even globally could wind up being entirely different depending on who wins that elections. So the way we solve that in our models is by creating lots of different projections for lots of different possible futures. So we create a broad narrative that describes that possible future. And within each narrative, we describe a logically consistent set of assumptions. So if I take, for an example, a scenario that's like my best case scenario, in which all countries in the world take immediate and concerted action to keep global warming to within the 1.5 degree Paris targets, then you need to create an assumption set that aligns to that. So it has to include a drastic reduction in emissions, because there's no other way of getting there. Even if you believe that technology is really, really valuable here, you still need to drastically reduce your emissions from today to keep us within 1.5 degrees. So then you have to think about how that translates in the real world. And the first and most obvious thing is, okay, if we're cutting emissions, where are we going to get power from? And as we've said, some countries are really ahead on renewable energy, some countries are behind and laggards. So you need to come up with an energy mix for each country that's grounded in the current reality of what energy mixes currently look like, but then projected over time to allow for each country's commitments, whilst also taking into account growing economies, things like elections that might change things over time and potentially be tipping points for an individual country into what their energy mix looks like. And that might get you an idea for what the energy need looks like and what the energy supply looks like for each country, or at least each major economy. So that's one assumption that will go into something like that. And then you might think, okay, what about electrification of transport? That's going to be a big part of any transition to a low carbon economy. In our scenario where emissions are being drastically reduced, we're going to need to have an assumption about, okay, what proportion of vehicles will be electric? How efficiently will those vehicles run? How will that improve over time? And what will we be doing with all the old cars that we're getting rid of? And then more broadly, we need to start making assumptions about where the resources are coming from. So mining intensiveness, deforestation, and replanting assumptions. And you need to try and take all of these to make a view of the world and be able to project that forwards with your macroeconomic assumptions as well. And try and work out what that means for your organization and the organizations you invest in on a line by line basis. So it starts to get very, very complicated. But we can always draw it back to that core broad narrative of, okay, this is a 1.5 degree world and everything that needs to happen is built up in those assumptions.
That's extremely helpful. I've a very thoughtful articulation. I like the way you built it up from stress testing, and you kind of you can increase the complexity. So that makes a lot of sense. I think one natural follow-up I have to that is, think of it fundamentally. What are some of the key inputs in terms of like what you use in terms of the models and the scenarios, and what are some of the outputs? So whether that be metrics, KPIs, ranges, reports, and how do those support the disclosures? So if you think of inputs, outputs, how they support disclosures.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it depends from company to company. I mean, a lot of the first challenge is really just working out what your emissions are for the company that is doing the reporting. And that's, it's not that hard to do, but it requires data, and that's not data that company has necessarily been set up to capture in the past, because why would it? It's not something that's been required historically, and generally you don't do things you're not required to do unless you're really far ahead of the curve. So that's a challenge there, just in working out what your emissions are. Then in terms of the other inputs to some of the more broader scenario analysis stuff, I mean, as I've said, you need to try and work out future pathways for the world. So the most common scenarios used are the NGFS scenarios, the Network for Greening of Financial Services. They have limitations, and I might come on to a few of those later on in the episode and discuss those. But essentially, they're the ones that are most commonly used in industry, and they describe three broad pathways to the transition: one that transitions very effectively and quickly, one that puts this off for a decade and then transitions, and one where nobody in the world does anything and we all let global warming happen. And each of those comes with a set of underlying assumptions about what carbon pricing might look like, what energy mixes look like. So those are really the key inputs. When it gets to company level inputs, you need to start looking at the individual supply chains. What does this company actually rely on to produce what it produces? If you're looking at Apple, for instance, you need to be looking at lithium as a key sort of input into that organization. I tend to work with financial services, where actually you're one step removed because you're investors in the companies and it's them that have the supply chains, rather than the asset manager itself or the insurance company itself.
Great. So that's the inputs. In terms of the outputs now, what comes out of that? Like what's shared in terms of, the disclosures?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, still at an early stage for a lot of organizations in disclosure, and a lot of what they're talking about is, okay, this is what our emissions look like. This is how we're going to reduce our own emissions. Trying to get their arms around what emissions in the supply chain look like, which is a lot harder to do, and actually when most organizations, the majority of their emissions come from, especially in financial services. A lot of organizations are using this modeling stuff and going quite a lot further in what they can put out. So you might see some of the ones who are very exposed to physical risk. You might see some global heat maps of sort of where those risks are going to crop up, where they're most exposed in terms of both where their biggest property investments are and parts of their supply chain that rely on a physical presence, and also how that relates to increased risk in those areas. So potential sort of loss as a result of physical climate risk. And then on the transition side, typically much simpler in terms of the outputs and visualization, because you're looking at sort of charts of by industry, how much do you think this might lose? How much do you think this might gain? What could the potential impacts be under each scenario?
Okay, great. So I think that was like the broad spectrum of the scenario analysis, but narrowing on that a little bit more in terms of what, and that's going to involve several parties.
Mhm.
But how specifically do actuaries get involved with climate scenario analysis?
Yeah, I think actuaries are in a really valuable position for a number of reasons, and not just to be involved in scenario analysis, but to be involved in climate and sustainability work as a whole. So firstly, I think actuaries are typically very well positioned as highly respected decision makers at many of the key points and pivots around which finance flows. So asset managers and asset owners, pension schemes, insurance companies, people know who actuaries are, respect actuaries' decision making and modeling and ability to understand and project models into the future. And that means that the decisions that actuaries make, or at least contribute to, can affect quite a lot of capital. So that's one reason why actuaries are quite important to this discussion. Secondly, I think it's also that we're very used to modeling uncertainty. I've learned throughout my career that many professionals have a really hard time seeing value in something that they know is wrong. And one thing you can say about every single actuarial projection ever made is that it's wrong. And wrong doesn't mean useless. And that's quite a big philosophical chasm to leap. But it's just natural to the way actuaries think. We do this all the time. One of my favorite examples of this is actually a comic. It was to do with Brexit, actually. But someone is essentially, the comic is a guy is asking three people whether they should jump off that cliff over there. And the first person says, oh, that cliff looks to be about 10 feet high. You'll probably get hurt if you jump off it. The second person says, I think it's around 15 feet. You could easily break a leg. And the third person says, I reckon it's 20 feet. You're risking serious injury if you jump. At which the guy who's asking the question says, well, you guys can't agree on anything. Is it 10, 15, or 20 feet? I'm just going to jump. And it doesn't matter that they were all wrong and it could have been 12 feet or 18.659 feet or whatever it was. The answer was the same. Don't jump. It's a bad idea. And so the actual conclusion of the models that we do can be a lot more useful than the final number and the exact result that comes out. So I think that understanding of uncertainty and projecting things that are uncertain is a really valuable skill that actuaries have. What I would then do is take a step back and potentially discourage actuaries from getting too involved in the detail. Because I think, and I say this with as much modesty as I can muster, actuaries are very clever people. And it can be very easy to get into a mindset of being able to solve every problem you've ever faced. And a real turning point for me where I realized that actually I'm not the right person to be doing this detailed climate modeling. I don't have the expertise, is when I was talking at dinner with someone who has a PhD in modeling flooding. And I was asking him some questions about river flooding. And he just looked at me like I was crazy and said, I don't do rivers, I do coastal flooding. You want a guy with a different PhD for river flooding. And that made me realize the level of expertise that people go into in this industry there's so much there. And we need to be able to take advantage of that and help them translate it to people who make the decisions. But there's no way I'm going to go and get a PhD in river flooding myself to fill that gap. I need to be able to work with these people. And I think I need to understand where to take a step back from that and say, okay, I'm bright, but I'm not as bright as you at river flooding, and I'm going to trust your results here.
I was actually going to ask about, just purely out of curiosity, is like what kind of modeling? So it sounds like you have very specific domain experts doing particular different types of modeling. So
yeah, so this one in particular was looking at UK real estate. And this was a big real estate book all over the UK and trying to get an understanding of what potential flood risk would look like in the future. And we're very lucky in the UK that we have really, really good flood maps. A government agency was set up decades ago to sort of work out what all the floodplains are, monitor it over the years, see when things flood, when they don't flood, relate that to rainfall and things. So we've got a really good data set to build it off. And then these guys have started projecting that into the future for different rainfall amounts, difference of wind patterns, different levels of soil erosion, and loads of other stuff to see what it might look like in the future. And that's a level of detail that no actuary is going to get into.
Yeah, floodplains are in the US are interesting, and we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. No, you know, as you said, this is an emerging discipline when we talk about scenario analysis. So what are some of the key gaps to date in climate scenario analysis?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to recognize that no scenario is perfect, no matter how much time you invest in it, and no scenario ever will be perfect. So there's gaps that are fatal flaws that we should worry about, and there's gaps that we can learn to live with. We know they're there. We can describe the limitations to decision makers and carry on with our flawed scenario. So it's becoming, I think, generally accepted, or at least increasingly accepted. And this is largely thanks to a paper that the IFOA, Institute of Faculty of Actuaries, did with the University of Exeter that was called the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, that took a really deep look at the NGFS scenarios. and put a lot of work into understanding and, more importantly, articulating the limitations of those scenarios. There was also a recent bulletin from the Bank of England that was about measuring climate risk that actually references that IFOA paper as well, but goes a bit further into talking about some of the key limitations we should think about. And I think it's generally the way I would summarize them are they don't capture the full suite of risks. No possible scenario projection can, but some models, and particularly the NGFS hothouse world scenarios, are quite implausible in what they show. Going back to the CBES exercise of 3 years ago, some of the first scenario modeling I did showed that the best economic scenario was 4 degrees of global warming. That's just completely implausible. Economically, that would destroy so much of any market. It's just completely unbelievable. But that's what the modeling was showing. So we had to recognize that is a serious flaw and error in the model. I think calibrating the risks correctly is a key limitation and issue with the model. We tend to only really have historical data, and historical data can fatally underestimate nonlinear relationships. So risks might develop more quickly than we realize and more quickly than scenarios suggest. And then we've talked a little bit about how difficult it is to factor in new technologies, whether you should go all in and say, well, technology is going to be a silver bullet and we should allow for every kind of new technology that's out there, versus allow for nothing and say, look, there's no technological answer that we can take into account in our scenarios. Like I say, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but your scenario will need to take a call on to, okay, what do you allow? How much do you allow carbon capture and storage to eat up that last bit? What do you allow in terms of offsets? And offsets are getting a little bad press because I think they are a fundamental, important part of the solution, but they're not being used in the right way right now, and they're not very robust and not very validated. So again, the truth is always somewhere in the middle there. And the final key limitation of scenarios is climate tipping points. So those are really hard to factor into scenarios. And the science really, at least from my perspective, I'm sure it's well understood by lots of people, but in terms of the actuarial world and the clients that I've worked with, only just really beginning to be taken into account. And essentially these climate tipping points are key sort of global issues where if you hit a certain point of global warming, things will get much, much worse. So the examples that are often given are melting of specific ice sheets, so the Greenland sheet or the West Antarctic sheet. If those melt after we hit a certain level of warming, that will push warming up further no matter what we do. And it becomes much, much harder to stop, and you almost get this snowball effect. I think I prefer snowballing points myself rather than tipping points, but tipping points is the generally used term. And lots of things like that are some that are well understood, like melting sea ice, some that are much, much harder to predict, like prevailing sea currents being put off course, all could have huge impacts that are really hard to factor into scenarios.
So in light of those challenges, like what are your thoughts on addressing some of those key challenges or addressing some of those gaps, sorry?
Yeah, so I think like I said when I started this section, there's gaps you should address, and there's gaps where it's okay to say, look, we don't know the answer. It's a recognized limitation of this model. We need to make our choices with the best data we have. And I always come back to my favorite quote from Sherlock Holmes here, which is where Sherlock is talking to Watson. He says, data, data, data. I cannot make bricks without clay. Data is always the answer here. We need more of it. We need better data. We need more validated data, broader data sets to really get to grips with what the answer can be. And I think the Bank of England bulletin gets into quite a lot of that, because what they're doing is encouraging firms to extend the scenarios that they use to improve the granularity and improve resolution of physical risks, derive sort of related variables. I've talked about in our scenario analysis how you need to have that logically consistent set of variables. Some of those can be derived from others, and you need to understand how those go together, and data can be part of that solution. And then determining the extent to which long-term risks can be priced in is the key part of the model. So how much do asset prices already take into account of all this stuff? If everyone knows that this is going to be an issue, then to some extent, assets are being priced on that basis. And so the answer to all of those is data. So looking at just one example that the Bank of England looked at, which was how to do this for residential mortgages and how to improve the modeling there, what the Bank of England was suggesting is, okay, you need data at the individual asset level. For each of the houses in your portfolio, you need things like energy performance certificates to understand how much price shock might impact individual households and what it might mean for what they do going forwards. You also then need data on macroeconomic variables. So you need to understand things like household disposable income, what default rates look like in different macroeconomic climates, what household debt to solvency ratios look like and how that can impact things. And then finally, the big data on the macro climate variables. So the flood risk data that we talked about, if we're talking about sort of mortgages and UK property, outside the UK, it gets a lot broader, and you're not just having to deal with flood, but having to deal with much bigger risks, especially if you look at coastal areas. I think scenario analysis is powerful even with its limitations. Any refinement that we make to scenarios and reductions in those limitations only makes it more powerful. It's fair to conclude that improving data capture, improving data sourcing, working with a variety of different third-party data providers, and there are some great organizations that are getting set up purely to try and fix this data gap. I think that's a key step for any firms to take. And then also just remember, being decision useful can be about helping users to understand where the flaws are and where the limitations are. There's always that classic quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah.
Always come back to that and remember that as long as we know where our model is wrong, we can still use it.
Great. No, we talk a lot about data. You mentioned data a few times, and well, we mentioned it several times throughout the course of this conversation. And this is something that, based on what I've seen, you appear to be passionate about, is data visualization. Now, data visualization, that's an important toolkit for actuaries in the modern world. So if we think of this topic broadly, what are some of the most important considerations regarding data visualization?
Yeah, so for me, data visualization is a tool for persuading. I think if you spend enough time with data, it starts to tell a story. And actuaries who spend all day, every day in that data become very familiar with that story. They're able to glean insights quite quickly just from looking at the data sets or the calculations based off them. The problem is, and the thing that a lot of people forget, is that decision makers in the business aren't spending all day, every day in the data. They don't have that familiarity, and so they can miss that story quite easily. And data visualization is almost a shortcut. It tells the story in a way where you don't need to have seen the data or understood the data to get the insights and to make the right decisions. Potentially, it can even reveal new insights and allow people to ask really interesting questions. I think that shortcut to storytelling is vital. It's almost like if you were asked to explain to me about Roman architecture, you have a choice between giving me two really dry textbooks on architecture I could spend hours reading, or we could spend 5 minutes walking around the Colosseum. And I know the second one is the one that would allow me to really understand the point and understand what Roman architecture is about. Data visualization is kind of like that. It's give people the information they need in a way that they can engage with it.
Great. Yeah. You know what they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Exactly.
Very simple. Yeah. So tying that back to the broader theme of scenario analysis now, data visualization, I think, just given some of the things we talked about, availability of data or lack of availability in some cases. So data visualization is one of the key challenges around scenario analysis. So other than, I know we mentioned availability, are there any other reasons why that challenge exists? Is it like form of data too? And I know there's different forms, some that are structured, unstructured. Are there any other reasons for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, data availability is the first one. As I said earlier, it's stuff that's there but just hasn't been captured in the past, because why would you? If I think about, I often sort of talk about Crowe as an organization here because it's a relatively easy organization in terms of calculating its own emissions. Consultancies are really easy because they don't make anything. We only sell people's time. Our emissions are largely the offices that we work in, people traveling to and from those offices and to client offices, any other supplies that we need for the office, the coffee beans and so on. So we're a really easy organization to do this for. And it is so hard nonetheless, and takes so many people so much time to work it out. And a large part of that is just that no company has ever structured themselves thinking about this stuff. We have 8 offices at Crowe. And each of those offices has a different coffee machine for staff to use. And under a traditional company structure, the way that you would set it up is you'd ask each office manager to source coffee beans for that office, and they would find probably the cheapest deal. And you might end up with 8 different suppliers just of coffee beans to the different offices. That means that anyone looking at the supply chain and trying to understand the sustainability of the supply chain has to talk to those 8 different suppliers and has to do the same investigation 8 times and follow 8 different supply chains. What companies need to start thinking about doing, and what we're already on our way to do at Crowe, it's quite a long journey, is draw that together and actually get the suppliers together and get your arms around that. And it might be more expensive if you go for one supplier, but that means you have so much less to look at and so much less to understand. You can actually start to work out what the emissions are from that supply chain and what other issues there might be with that supply chain. And I think we're seeing lots of different opportunities to use data visualization in that, not just in the data capture part, but then in terms of how we interrogate and how we start to move things forwards. And one thing I've been working on recently that I found really interesting is reducing emissions from employee commuting, because that sits within a company's own emissions, that the emissions that employees generate getting to and from work are part of the company emissions. And companies have been trying to cut those for ages, even before, reducing emissions was particularly popular. And there's lots of ways that companies have tried that. And a very common way of doing that is investing money in cycle to work schemes and encouraging people to cycle in and use lower carbon forms of transport. And that sounds like a great idea. We did some data visualization at Crowe where we took everyone's commuting patterns in. We wrote some code in R to visualize it. It looks really cool. What we found when we drew it as a picture was that even though most our staff work in London, those people aren't generating emissions on their commute. Everyone in London takes public transport. There might be a couple of people who drive once a week to a train station nearby and then get the train into London. But generally it's train, tube, bus, cycle, walk. Those are the main method of transport into London. And then for the staff that are outside of London, well, okay, Manchester has a pretty good public transport network. We don't need to worry about those. But we have regional offices where people are driving 30, 40 miles to get to the office every day. And we've been saying for years, cycle to work. That's the scheme, that's the solution. You're not going to do that 30, 40 miles there and back every day. So that's not a solution that works for all the offices. And we would never have realized that until we started visualizing this and plotting it out and seeing those actual pathways that people take and realizing London is probably going to be okay because people are taking the tube. If we want to reduce our commuting emissions, we need to figure out what the people in the Cheltenham office need and the other regional offices need and see how we can reduce their emissions. And that's a really simple bit of visualization, but really, really powerful. And immediately decision makers can see what the issue is, can see how to solve the problem, and can start taking actual action based off it.
You mentioned R. Just one quick follow-up I had on that is like, what are some of the most common tools and packages you're seeing being used for data visualization?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a big proponent of open source software. I'm quite a big R user myself. My team prefers Python and will always tell me it's better, but I'm just terrible at it, which is probably why I don't prefer it. I think one thing that many people outside of financial services, any of the students listening, don't realize is just how reliant everything in financial services is on Excel. Excel is most of what you see used for every kind of data management, data capture, data visualization, anything to do with data. Even just people writing lists and meeting notes, it'll go in Excel. And I have never understood why on that matter thing. It's helpful that Excel is getting better. I think Microsoft have realized the key pivotal role that they play in financial services globally with Excel and are trying to actually invest in it and make it more robust. You might remember, you may not being in the UK, but listeners in the UK might remember how during COVID, there was data being copied from one Excel spreadsheet to another, and Excel wasn't big enough, and we lost a bunch of COVID deaths as a result of that and had to readjust it a few weeks later. Oh, no. It just got dropped from the data because Excel wasn't big enough. That kind of thing isn't going to happen going forward. Spreadsheets are getting bigger and more robust every day, but they're still not the best tool for most purposes. Excel is a very good general purpose tool, very poor at specific problems that need to be solved. But I think one of the reasons it's so prevalent is that everyone knows how to use it. And even though I've talked all about sort of giving people the picture that tells 1,000 words and the story they need to make their decision, there's still people at the most senior level who like to just get in and play with the data a little bit. And if I give them a bunch of R code, they're just going to not know what to do with it. If I give them a spreadsheet, they can at least have a play around and play with some of the assumptions themselves. So yeah, unfortunately, a lot of what I do still tends to be in Excel, and I've occasionally built stuff in R in the first instance and then built it in Excel when someone asked for it. It's just the way the world is.
Yeah, welcome to my world, trying to get people to move beyond Excel. But yeah, we'll end on that note is actuaries. Yes, we know you're comfortable, but there are other, more powerful, appropriate tools out there. So we'll just leave it at that. Well, yeah, thanks, Lloyd. This was very insightful, and looking forward to sharing this with the community. And again, want to thank you for your time and just wishing you Wonderful rest of the day, probably the evening for you. I know you're a little bit ahead of me. So
Afternoon now, still sunny, fortunately. Finally got the sun here. Spring took until this weekend to finally hit the UK. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful one. Take
You
care.
too.
Bye.